Hello, everybody. My name is John Chunky, and I feel very privileged to be invited to chair this session on perspectives on radicalization pathways. Firstly, I just want to acknowledge the previous session and particularly the Q&A on communities, partnerships and trust. I strongly recommend that anyone listening to this session who didn't manage to hear the previous one, download the recording when it becomes available. Also, before our speakers begin, I'd also like to remind you to forward any questions via the Zoom Q&A function so that I can put them to our speakers after they've delivered their presentations. So our first presentation is by Associate Professor Bart Schuurman and Dr. Sarah Carthy of the Institute of Security and Global Affairs at Leiden University. Bart and Sarah's presentation is non-involvement in terrorist violence, understanding the most common radicalization outcome. So over to you, Bart and Sarah.
Thank you, John. I'll just share my screen with you. Now, hopefully you can see that. Thank you so much, John, and thank you for having us. We're coming to you live from The Hague in the Netherlands. It's not morning time, it's 11:30 at night, but great to be able to connect with Australia. It's not someplace we often get to connect to, so this is a great opportunity. My name is Sarah Carthy. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at Leiden University in the Institute of Security and Global Affairs. And with me, we have Dr. Bart Schuurman, who's the project lead and brains behind this idea. And together, we're going to talk to you a little bit about our progress on this project so far. We're not at the end, we're only about halfway through. Talk to you a little bit about the concept, the methodology, and then Bart will take over and he'll give you some preliminary findings and some take-home messages, I suppose. We should note that the research has been funded by the NWO, which is the Dutch Research Council, and by the Canadian government as well. So the idea behind this project, I guess, is rooted in an idea we're all very familiar with, which is the idea of radicalization and the idea that for those who come to perpetrate terrorist violence, it's generally accepted that the vast majority will first undergo a process of radicalization into terrorism. And this process, the mechanics of it and how to stop it from happening, that's very much dominated counterterrorism discourse for the last number of years. But with this idea, this radicalization idea, there is a caveat, and that caveat is that for those who radicalize, the vast majority will actually never come to become involved in planning, perpetrating, or commissioning terrorist violence at all. And this is a subpopulation of which we actually know very little. Now, this is a problem for a number of reasons. Ultimately, what that knowledge offers, or the question it addresses, it's really a question that guides almost any study of undesirable behavior, and that is what sets certain people apart. And without this knowledge, we find ourselves faced with a situation in which we can explain why certain people reach this sharp end of a trajectory, but we don't even have an exploratory understanding of why the vast majority of people don't. So this is what we refer to as a specificity problem. And when we look at research on people who have been radicalized, we find that violent perpetrators are overrepresented in the data that we use. And that means if we have identified, for example, risk factors that are supposed to predict assignment to a violent category, if those risk factors also predict assignment to the non-violent category, then they're not really risk factors for violent radicalization or terrorism. More so, we're masking discrepancies in the population at large, and we're obscuring potential protective factors, which could explain why people don't get to the point of transitioning into terrorism or violence on behalf of terrorism. Now, this question, or this issue, I suppose, we have with not having enough non-violent radicalized people to look at, it's actually a nice question to have, because as terrorism and radicalization researchers, we are working in a very novel area, and as exciting as it is new, which means that we haven't come to the stage of honing or developing methodologies which would be stringent enough to answer these sorts of questions. So we have to borrow from other disciplines. And this type of question, what sets certain people apart, this is asked in so many disciplines, ranging from health to even other aggression and violent behaviours. And we generally see that the best design to answer this kind of exploratory question is what we term a similar systems, different outcome design. Ultimately, what we do and what we're doing with this project is we're selecting individuals based on what we term their outcome status. So there's one of two potential outcomes that we're interested in: those who radicalize and go on to become involved in terrorist violence, and those who radicalize and don't reach that point. And what it looks like, I guess, in practice is that we try to identify the distribution of variables across this population and see, is there a difference between those who reach this outcome and those who reach the other one? So what we're doing is we're tracking a person's trajectory to the outcome of interest and seeing if there's any differences when we disaggregate those people. Now, in line with the British Medical Journal guidelines for conducting these sorts of studies, like I said, we're lucky because we understand, we can borrow from other disciplines that have really clear guidelines of how to conduct these sorts of studies and answer these types of questions. So we're being mindful of three main things with this project. The first, and I'll talk about these in turn, the first is our sampling method, who we choose. The second is the ascertainment of exposure, that's to do with the variables. I'll discuss that. And then finally, probably the most pressing concern is that of minimizing bias. So in terms of the sampling method, we ultimately want to select individuals that come from a particular population. And the population that we've defined, unsurprisingly, is radicalized individuals. Now, that might seem common sense, but it's actually something we have to be specific about. Sometimes individuals commit terrorist violence and there isn't evidence of a radicalization trajectory. They might be doing it for financial reasons, for example. So that sort of person wouldn't be included in our data set. They all need to be radicalized and matched from the same pool. And to that end, we're including individuals from North America and Europe. I'm leading the North America end and Bart is leading the European end. And they all need to be homegrown, so they need to be socialized in the country of origin and to an extent radicalized in that country and to be carrying out their activities in that country. So foreign fighters and things like that we don't really include. And then active in the post-1980s era. The reason for this, I suppose, is so we can minimize the amount of extraneous variables that could, vary depending on the time or depending on what was going on politically or in the environment. So we're limiting it to the post-1980s era. And then we simply define cases and controls. So what we mean by this is that everyone in that population has to have the potential to become violent. We can't include an individual who radicalized in prison, spent their whole trajectory in prison, and classify them as a non-violent person because they couldn't physically commit the violence if they wanted to. So they didn't have the same potential. And in that way, they're not a person that we're interested in looking at. Now, having said that, with these types of studies, they are exploratory and it is difficult to satisfy all these things, match people as well as you can. But to try and do it as best we can, we're engaging in a process called individual matching, which means that for every violent person, we have a non-violent counterpart, and that's matched based on when they were active and the type of ideology that they ascribe to. So Salafi jihadists are matched, and then the right wing are matched as well, just to make sure we don't end up with uneven numbers and stuff like that. And then in terms of the variables that we look at, it was important that they were all theoretically informed, and they actually come from lots of different disciplines. We have a code book of almost 160 items, and what we do is we code the individual for these items based on primary or secondary data that we acquire. What the variables look like, some of them are structural, so what things were happening in the environment, and was there an armed conflict ongoing when the person radicalized, real higher order stuff. group level variables. Did the person become involved in a group? What was the size of the group? And what was the strategy of the group? And we also have several individual level variables, which include maybe demographic variables, but also trickier ones like psychological, mental disorder, developmental disorder, and so on. So we have a lot of variables to look at for sure. And like I said, we're looking at primary and secondary sources. So personal recall, we've interviewed quite a lot of individuals, psych evaluations, court transcripts, and also other secondary sources like autobiographies and things like that. In terms of the bias, like I said, I'm covering the North American end and Bart is covering the European end. And we want to make sure that the way we code is not diverging over time. We come from different disciplines, so it's important that we're on the same page. So to minimize the bias, we have assessed the reliability of the code book at various junctures. We randomly code cases and then we come back together and see if we've agreed. It's an iterative process to make sure that we're always on the same page. But that's just the methodology. We do have some preliminary findings. So I'll pass it over to Bart and he'll take it from there. So thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Let me see if I can get the screen sharing to work. I hope everyone can see it. Yeah, excellent. All right. So thank you, Sarah, for the very thorough background and introduction to our project. And if technology will let me, what I wanted to do now is just talk you through a couple of our preliminary findings. Now, I'm at the same time excited to do so and a little bit hesitant, because as Sarah mentioned, we have a project that at the moment is split in two parts. So Sarah's coding the North American cases, I'm looking at the European ones. And what I'm presenting here now in terms of preliminary findings is based on those European cases. The very thing is, it might look different once we're done with data collection in its entirety, once we bring all of our cases together. And so please keep in mind, these things might look different once we finalize that stage of our project. At the same time, some of the differences that we're seeing and that I'll be talking about do seem to be rather large. So I have a good gut feeling, if I could call it that some of these will hold up over time. So those kind of things aside, what are we talking about? So at the moment, there's 115 cases to which these findings apply. We're still working on that. Ultimately, we hope to have 200 plus cases. But for now, what are we seeing? So if we look at the extremists who do not use terrorist violence, they seem to differ from those who do in a number of ways. So first of all, these non-terrorist violent extremists appear to be more likely to feel politically represented, to have some parties in power or some parties they could vote for that at least to some extent represent the ideas they have, giving them the option, at least on paper, of pursuing their aims through non-violent ways. They're also less likely to perceive the state as an enemy that at this point in time is using repressive force against them. They're very often negative about the state, but there isn't that acute sense of crisis. They are not pointing towards examples of state overreach, of excessive use of force, and saying, look, we have to act now, otherwise it's too late. These extremists who don't turn to terrorist violence are also likely to participate in bigger, that is, as in more members, and older groups. And our thinking here is that if you're an extremist group in a democratic society, you can only really survive for a longer amount of time and get to become older and larger in membership numbers terms if you by and large stick within the existing rules, right? So, maybe you're skirting around the edges of what's acceptable, but you can't really openly advocate armed violence, for instance, and still expect to be around as an organization. So perhaps they are socialized to some extent to operate within the boundaries of the acceptable, essentially acting as a brake on terrorist violence. In terms of what they think about violence, there seems to be also not so much hesitation in moral sense, right? They're often quite open about violence being morally acceptable, but there's some qualifications. Often violence is couched in terms of not being necessary right now, but is kind of deferred to a later date. And strategically, these kinds of groups, individuals are also a bit more ambivalent about how they see violence as fitting into their agendas. And so whereas the more terrorist inclined extremists will prioritize use of violence. These extremists not involved in terrorist violence often have a mixed approach, preferring, for instance, to try and gain power through local politics, and only when that fails, they might escalate to much more violent ways of operating. Then, if we look also at these people's ties to society on a more individual level, we see a couple of kind of classic breaks on, I would say, delinquent, or in this case, very violent behavior. So they're more likely to have and maintain employment or to be involved in programs of study, more likely to have family responsibilities. They also seem to have higher degrees of self-control, something that we're also trying to assess, even though it's very difficult to do at a distance. And something else that seems to be very interesting and it seems to be holding up quite well is a lower sense of ideological commitment. If, generalizing as I am now, it does look like these extremists who don't use terrorist violence tend to more often kind of talk about their views, kind of, make it seem as if this is very important to them, but in practice are not really willing to give up important responsibilities in pursuit of their aim. So for instance, they'll still maintain their jobs. They won't go into activities that are so dangerous to themselves that they might end up in prison or might end up killed. So there seems to be a lower ideological commitment overall. Some other interesting things standing out that I might just cover a bit more quickly is that they seem more likely, the non-involved in terrorist violence extremists, to have been raised in middle or upper class neighborhoods. So there's definitely something about the environment in which these people live at a point of radicalization that seems to be relevant. And they're also much more likely to have and maintain over time, so also during the radicalization phase, a higher degree of viewpoint diversity in their social network. So whereas most of these extremists tend to kind of, I would say, shed some of their old social contacts, no longer see friends, no longer see their families so much, and prioritize time with their extremist compatriots, those who don't turn to terrorist violence do, for the most part, still have these ties to people with different views or people who are simply uninterested in anything to do with their ideology. And we do think that this tends to kind of prevent them, even if it's just a little bit, from really fully committing, going down this ideological rabbit hole. They're also much more likely to fear the costs of involvement, something I touched on earlier. So you see more often that they're not willing to run the risk of losing a job or ending up in prison or ending up injured or dead. And finally, something we think is also quite relevant is that the non-involved in terrorist violence extremists, they tend to find other outlets for their ideological preoccupations, and those are non-violent activism. Now, it doesn't mean that their activism isn't, very confrontational, it's very extremist in nature, but they, by and large, again, abide to existing laws, stick within the kind of the boundaries of the democratic order. So, for instance, they might try to spread leaflets, they might try to gain seats in local elections, they might try to set up national political parties, all of which has potential for lots of unpleasantness down the road, but in the here and now does seem to act as a brake on these individuals and their groups' interest in really escalating to the use of terrorist violence. Now, just to round off, because I think we're in our final 2 minutes, I would say that at this point, there seems to be, if I had to generalize about these two categories that we're using, the following difference. So on the one hand, the people who turn to extremism but fall short of using terrorist violence, there seems to be a much more strong search for belonging and identity. So the kind of benefits of group membership or being taken up in these broader right-wing extremist or Salafi jihadist movements tend to be really front and center in also the accounts they give of their involvement. Whereas for people who do turn to terrorism, it's really much more functional. So extremism really as this vehicle for revolutionary change, and it isn't so much about the benefits of belonging and identity and sense of meaning. So we do see lots of differences. We expect we'll be able to talk about those in much more detail as our project matures, as it progresses. At the same time, I also want to emphasize as a kind of closing statement here, that we also see lots of similarities between these two groups of extremists. And one area where that's particularly apparent is in the prevalence of broken families. So many of these individuals come from really broken homes, have pasts in which lots of disruptive events have taken place. And this would be very interesting to contrast with, let's say, the population at large. So this project isn't even done. We're already thinking about other things we could do, but that's it for now. And we hope to be able to talk you through, probably in the shape of an article or two, our full findings at some point next year. For now, thank you very much for your attention. And we both look forward to any questions you may have.
Thank you, Sarah and Bart. That was absolutely terrific. And we really appreciate your willingness to share your work with us from Den Haag at the middle of the night. Certainly identifying people of genuine CVE concern and ensuring our risk assessment tools are fit for purpose is a key concern for my colleagues and I in the Department of Home Affairs portfolio. And you may also be interested to note that the Vera2R tool, which is also based in the Netherlands, is our principal risk assessment tool here in Australia. Okay, so now I'd like to introduce Professor David Bright from Deakin University. David's presentation is an exploration of network social dynamics to illuminate radicalization processes. Over to you, David. Thank you.
Thanks very much, John. Let me share my screen. Now, are you able to see the regular slides there, or am I showing a presenter view? John, is that working all right?
I think it's presenter view.
Let me see what I can do about that. No. I am not entirely sure how to fix this.
Ben, any advice?
No, but I can share slides on your behalf if you need, David.
Yeah, that might be good, Ben. Sorry. Thank you.
Thank you.
One moment.
Great. Thanks very much. So just by way of a few introductory comments on this project. So it's a project that was done by a combined team of researchers from Deakin University, from Melbourne University, but also from the DSTG group. And we received funding from the Victorian Department of Justice. A couple of quick caveats before I get started. Firstly, the project that we had in mind is a project around the contribution or the place of networks within radicalization processes and radicalization social processes. We had in mind a project that would look at both pro-social influences or pro-social interconnections within networks, and also processes, social processes and social influences that would lead people down the road of radicalization. For a whole range of reasons I won't go into, we found less about the former, but quite a bit about the latter, and that's what this presentation will primarily focus on. The second caveat is that these really are preliminary results. Firstly, because of the type of data that we've used, but secondly, because of the nature of the analysis. So we are continuing to refine both the coding that we've used in a number of places, but also we're continuing with the analyses. So the results that I'm presenting today really should be seen as being preliminary. If we could move to the next slide, please. So just by way of background with respect to network approaches and social network analysis in particular has been employed in a range of areas. So organizations and the way that organizations interact with each other, the way that people interact with each other, the way that kids interact in classrooms, issues around health and say, the spread of viruses in pandemics. Social network analysis and social networks have provided real insights in a number of those different areas. And certainly over the last 20 years or so, there's really been an expansion of the use of the network lens or the network framework to understand groups that operate in illicit contexts. There's been a lot of work on organised crime, and there's been quite a bit of work in the terrorism space. The advantages or the contribution that a network approach can make is that it provides a complementary approach to more individual type approaches. So many individual type approaches and statistical analyses assume that there's independence between individuals in say a sample. In a network approach, we're assuming that there is actually interdependence, and that interdependence is meaningful. In the organised crime space, networks can be used to counter stereotypes around the hierarchical nature of the groups. And in the terrorism space, as well as those other spaces I've mentioned, the network approach really allows one to seek rather than assume structure, of social structure, as one of my great colleagues, Carlin Morcelli, pointed out many years ago. So we've done a bit of work previously, and that little network that you see on the bottom right-hand side is a representation of an Australian extremist network that we were able to collect some data on. And as I'll explain shortly, the current project sort of piggybacks on that data. So if I could move to the next slide, please. So in the current study, we're using what I'll call advanced social network analysis techniques. You'll, I think, be pleased to know I won't go into lots of the detail about that, but certainly happy to answer any questions or discuss the detail with those who are interested. To investigate and to understand the network processes, the social dynamics that are responsible for radicalisation of individuals who are part of what we're calling an Australian extremist network. And the research questions that we're asking really focus on the types of ties that we see within this network, the types of ties between actors, and also the types of ties that actors form by joining organisations, extremist organisations, and how those ties relate to radicalisation and processes of radicalisation. And of course, we're interested in the combinations of different types of ties between actors and between organisations and how they influence the risk that someone is radicalised. Next slide, thank you. So in terms of data collection, we collected, as many of you will know, data collection in this space, particularly the sort of social network or illicit network space is fraught with difficulties. It's hard to get one's hands on good data, but we've used open source data from both OSLI, which is a database of judges' sentencing comments. We heard a bit about that yesterday from the group doing work on hate crime and the hate crime database. We also used media articles as well as sort of a complementary or a triangulation of that data. And we started with the network that I hinted at in the previous slide that we'd done some work on previously. And what we sought to do was sort of expand on that information that we had on that network. So we sought as much detailed demographic information on actors in the network. We looked at ties to other people, so including family, friends, people that were collaborating in one way or another and having contact. And we sought to gather information about the actual ties between people. We also sought to establish the timestamps. So we sought to establish the time at which ties were formed and ties were ceased, and the time frame of radicalization of individuals in the network. So that's no mean feat. That was quite a difficult process. There was some missing data, but where possible, we were able to establish the timeframes of some of these events. And we also determined whether or not people had been radicalized by applying a set of criteria, such as holding extremist views or plotting an act of terror. Next slide, thank you. Now, in terms of the method, again, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about the method, but just to say that what we conducted was a sort of an advanced social network analysis methodology that looked at the coevolution or change over time of both the ties between actors and also radicalization of individuals. We were able to slice the data into 5 time periods. The data went from 2004 to 2019, and we conducted what's called a stochastic actor-oriented model on those 5 time periods. These types of models are what we might call advanced social network models that can reveal different types of structures in networks, but also different types of social processes in networks that I'll come to shortly. So within this model, actors can create ties. They can become a member of an extremist group or an organization, and they can become radicalized. If we can move to the next slide, thanks. I'll spend a little bit of time just going through the different types of network ties, because these are kind of critical and pretty key to some of the findings. These network ties were determined sort of from the ground up. So we sort of let the data that we were able to collect inform us around what types of ties were involved in the network. So we had family ties or partner ties. So these are ties based on familial connections or familial by marriage connections. We had friends or acquaintances. We had associate ties, what we called associate ties. These are really action-oriented ties, people being seen together, being arrested together, co-participating in some type of an event together, including violence, co-offending in non-terrorist related crime, spending time in prison together. So associate ties are action-oriented ties. Then we have contact and communication ties, people meeting face-to-face, sending text messages, sending each other emails, etc. Transactional ties are ties that involve some exchange of either material support, including weapons, or non-material support, such as information. So there's some kind of resource that's traveling between actors through the tie. We had counseling and mentoring ties, which involved any type of religious counseling, including indoctrination and any type of ideological influence. And then, of course, because of some of the data gaps, we had an unknown tie where we weren't able to specify from the data that we had. And it's important to point out that two people, called a dyad in social network lingo, can have more than one tie. So there can be multiple ties between people in the network. Next slide, thanks. So on to some results. The first thing to note is that from the period of data collection, so 2004 onwards up to about 2019, what we see in this figure is an increase in the number of people in the network who are being radicalized. So that jagged line going up on the right-hand side is the cumulative number of people who are radicalized in the network. And if you wouldn't mind clicking on that link, and hopefully this will work, I have a little brief video of the network over time. If that doesn't work, we might just move on, but if it does work, that'd be great.
Just a moment, David.
Thank you. are brilliant. So I'll just talk through, this is only a couple of minutes, but what you're seeing here is the network at the commencement of our data collection process. And what you'll see over time is individuals and groups joining that network. But what you'll also see is individuals represented by the dots moving from being not radicalized, in other words, represented by the green color, to being radicalized. So there's more individuals, more groups joining, or groups of individuals joining this network across time. So the network is growing across time, but we're also seeing that radicalization is moving through the network. And we might call that radicalization contagion, moving through the network. Great, thanks. And the next slide, thank you. Great, so now I'll just move to some of the results. And look, I'm not presenting, and again, to sort of save you from a lot of numbers and tables, I'm not presenting the raw results here. I'm just presenting an interpretation of the model. But again, if people are interested in seeing some of those tables and the results of the models, I'm very happy to have those discussions. So the first thing that we observe in the network over time, the first dynamic that we see is that friends of friends become friends. One of the most robust observations in social networks. People who know each other tend to become friends. So where two people are friends with person A, those two people are either already friends or become friends over time, and we see that in the network. Next slide, thanks. Friends, people who are tied by friendship ties, tend to become associates. So people who are tied by friendship ties tend to form those action-oriented ties that I described earlier. But this process doesn't happen the other way around. People who have associate ties don't form friendships. And we'll come back to that in a little while. Next slide, thanks. We see that that closure process that I described with respect to friends also occurs for associates. So associates of associates become associates. People close up those interconnections across time. The next slide. What we also see is that actors who are able to connect to many other actors form connections with others. So if you see the actor on the very left-hand side in the first figure, they form a connection to the actor in the middle, who is really operating as a broker and offering connections to those other two actors you see on the right-hand side. So brokerage, which is a sort of a key concept in the social network genre, it is really key in associate ties. There's processes going on within associate ties that sees brokerage as being a very important position and process. Next slide, please. With respect to radicalization and membership of organizations, what we found in our modeling is that extremist organizations attract radicalized actors. And I will come back to this shortly. Next slide, thank you. What we also found, and again, I sort of flagged this earlier on, that associate ties were sort of an important component of our results. People who have associate ties with radicalized individuals tend to become radicalized. So there's a radicalization contagion effect in our models with respect to those associate ties or action-oriented ties. And the next slide, thank you. Members of extremist organizations, we found, also form those associate ties. So where individuals are members of an extremist organization, they tend to form across time associate ties with each other, those action-oriented ties. Next slide, thank you. And then what we also found is that extremist organizations attract individuals who are connected by associate ties and who are radicalized. Next slide. So putting all of this together, and I know I'm sort of moving through this pretty quickly, but just putting all of this together in a way that we think makes some coherent sense around pathways to radicalisation, what we find that, and there's 3 slides here with respect to this sort of pathways to radicalisation idea. Firstly, radicalised actors join organisations with radicalised members. So there's no radicalisation in our results, no radicalisation occurring in extremist organisations. Next slide. We found that non-radicalised actors become friends with radicalised actors, but there's no direct risk in friendship ties. We found no direct risk of radicalisation. So this is a potentially protective dynamic that might move people away from radicalisation where there are pro-social influences. Next slide, thank you. So this is a slide that is focused on the formation and the growth of associate ties. So on the left-hand side, we see associate ties forming between friends and actors in extremist organisations forming associate ties. And then the 3 boxes to the right are talking about the growth of these ties. Associate ties grow in the network by recruitment of intermediaries through brokers. Radicalised actors recruit other radicalised actors as associates, forming associate ties. And we see that there is radicalisation of non-radicalised associates, illustrated by the figure at the top there. Next slide, thank you. I'm almost there, I will finish on time. Just some summary slide around the pathways to radicalisation that we found. Firstly, as I've said, no direct risk of friendship ties. There was no direct risk associated with belonging to, being part of an extremist organisation. Actors were radicalised before they joined. There were clusters of actors connected by associate ties that form within those organisations and also among radicalised. And clusters of actors can obviously support each other's beliefs, support each other's attitudes, and take action together. Friendship ties can lead to the formation of associate ties, even though friendship ties don't appear to pose any direct risk. But having an associate tie with a radicalised actor is a significant risk factor. Next slide, thank you. And this is the last slide. So in our view, the network framework really does offer a complementary and alternative to some individual level approaches. We think that it suggests that breaking the pathways of network facilitated influence can be critical, that there is potential for some protective network influence or diffusion that might counter some of the radicalising influences that we saw, and we're hoping to do some more work on that. And finally, our view is that the results that we have support peer-based interventions and support programs that might break some of these network pathways to radicalisation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that, David. That was excellent. And thank you, Ben, also for your superlative Zoom administration skills. David, your presentation has direct application to CVE intervention programs, and I think it also relates really well to Sarah and Bart's earlier presentation. So I'm looking forward to this Q&A. I'm really struck by how both presentations remind us that even at the individual level, violent extremism is a social phenomenon, and how important it is to understand an individual's social ties and their protective and risk promoting factors. So we now have some time to discuss your presentations in greater depth, and a quick reminder to post questions on the Q&A. Have a few here, which is terrific. The first question is for Bart and Sarah. Bart, how did you obtain your sample of non-violent extremists, and how do you know that they're not violent extremists?
I might actually take this question on behalf of Bart, and he might take the next one. But this is an excellent question, and it actually ties into something a little bit more complex in the project, which is that when we say non-violent, I suppose what we're talking about is not involved in terrorist violence. And that's not the same as not being violent. On the contrary, a lot of the non-violent people that I've spoken to, they'd find it hilarious that they're in the non-violent category, because they might have had checkered histories or involved in gang violence or street violence, where their opponents are kind of willing participants, or even things like domestic violence or violent crime. But what we're specifically interested in is the difference between individuals who go on to commit a terrorist attack, or are involved in planning a terrorist attack, or are intending to commit a terrorist attack but are thwarted by authorities or something like that. So that's what the two groups are. Now, in terms of identifying the radicalized people who do not go on to do those things, that still does pose a challenge, because when we think about the individuals in the involved category, a lot of them would be very well documented in media and so on. They would have written maybe autobiographies, and there'd be criminal cases against them, which would mean that a lot of their information is open access. And that is not the case with radicalized people who don't get to that point. A lot of them fly under the radar, and a lot of them would think what they've done isn't even that noteworthy. But when you look at it, they did demonstrate a radicalization trajectory. And when we look at indicators, they do meet that criteria. So the challenge was to identify these people. And how we did it, I suppose, was a few different ways, but definitely on the North American end, I found that accessing networks of formers, and they would work as gatekeepers, and then they would provide us access to individuals who were radicalized but didn't do anything. They might not even have left their bedrooms, but all of their activities and their mindset was indeed extremist. And I suppose it's nice because a lot of the non-violent people that I've spoken to, they've never spoken about their experiences before. So in many ways, the data is very much untouched, unrehearsed, and very, very raw as well. So I suppose that's one of the benefits of the way we're approaching things.
Yeah, great, Sarah. Thank you very much for that explanation. A question for David. In addition to friendship and associate ties, can you say anything about the role of kinship ties and how this might influence social dynamics?
Yeah, thanks for the question. In the models that we ran, we did not find any direct influence of family ties. That is somewhat surprising, and maybe that's where the question sort of came from. I think it's reasonable to expect that family ties could be and maybe under many circumstances a more pro-social influence, or potentially pro-social, but could also be radicalizing depending on the context. In our original conceptualization of the project, we were anticipating incorporating those family ties in both of those scenarios and as both of those scenarios. But as it turns out, at least based on the data that we have, we did not find any direct influence of family ties in the models. Now, that could be based on a number of methodological issues that are distinct from what I've just sort of covered in terms of, I guess, kind of conceptually and theoretically what we might have expected. But as I mentioned earlier, we're still working on this data. We're still looking at closely at the way we coded the data, looking very closely at the data itself and the potential of collecting other data to supplement what we have. But we're also looking at the way we ran the models. As anybody who's used models or interpreted models knows, models are only as good as the data that go into them. So we are looking very closely at the way we've done that modeling. So it's possible that moving forward, some of these results might shift around a bit, but at the moment, we're not seeing any impact or any influence of family in the results.
Great, thanks, David. And I guess a typical assumption is that as extremist ties begin to dominate a person's life, their pro-social sort of ties diminish. Is that something you're able to observe? Do you have data on that?
It's not something that we're able to necessarily observe in the data that we have, but that is absolutely the type of follow-up project that I think we'd really be interested in doing. So initially, that was really the kind of model that we were looking at, drawing from the sort of theories in criminology in particular around differential association, which is exactly what you're describing, where you have, a number of pro-social influences on the one hand and negative influences, whether it's moving someone towards crime or towards terrorism, and looking at the differential influence of those ties, both in terms of the number, but also the strength of those ties. So that would be a really neat follow-up project on what we've done. But of course, that kind of work depends on some pretty rich data that is obviously, challenging to get one's hands on in this space.
Yeah, totally. Thank you, David. A question for Sarah and Bart. Firstly, are the findings for those that do not turn to violence the direct opposite for those who do? For example, those that don't turn to violence have lower ideological commitment. Do those that turn to violence necessarily have higher ideological commitment? And do you think that your research has the ability to contribute to the creation of a risk assessment that may be able to filter out those that are less likely to turn to violent behavior? So a couple of questions in that question.
Well, thank you. I'll try my best to answer those. Let me start with the first one. So are we finding stark opposites for people involved in terrorist violence and those who weren't, but who were still extremists? And I think the answer to that is a no. So what we're trying to do is to kind of put things, well, many of these items represent a scale. So the example here is about ideological commitment. We have things about self-control, for instance. And what you'll see is that usually, so far, because it's still preliminary data, the people who were involved in terrorist violence, they tend to score higher, for instance, on ideological commitment. They tend to score a bit lower on things like self-control. But you'll always find counter cases. I mean, I think anytime we're dealing with complex human behavior, and involvement in terrorism certainly fits that description, it's unlikely that we'll be able to find, these very neat categories. But I think we can see, differences that do appear to be rather generalizable to either group. So that's the first question. And the second one, whether we're hoping this will inform threat assessment and similar work, and that's a definite yes. We hope, and so far also we're quite confident, given what we found in our data set, that this kind of information, not just on risk factors, but also how they develop over time, because we're very keen to get a sense of development for our items. So we're trying, for instance, to see if we can score whether someone was, let's say, very simple example, whether someone was employed prior to radicalization, whether they were then still employed during their radicalized period, and what happened with that employment. Did they continue as they were? Did they spend less time on work, or did they abandon it completely? So we're trying to do the similar thing for many other items, trying to really chart development over time. And we're marrying that with a focus not just on risk factors, but very clearly also on protective factors, right? So not just what has made these people more amenable to become involved in delinquent behavior, in this case terrorism, but also what might just keep them from perhaps crossing the threshold to violence. And ultimately, we do hope that focus, that kind of the way we set up our research design, combined with the in-depth data that we've been gathering, because I mean, we've been at this since January last year. So I think sometimes we feel like monks, just kind of trawling through data, trying to interview as many people as we can. And ultimately, we do hope they can also feed into threat assessment work, precisely by helping people identify perhaps those individuals who might be slightly less likely to actually turn their violent convictions, their extremist ideologies into terrorist attacks.
Oh, that's a great answer. Thank you. One of the things, Sarah and Bart, that you raised in your presentation was that you're seeing the prevalence of broken families and disruptive events in a person's sort of developmental years. That's a really interesting thing to find. It's not something surprising for other forms of criminal offending. And is that a historical change? Because I think previously we haven't really seen that as a particularly significant factor amongst religiously motivated violent extremists. Is that something that's sort of that you're measuring that's sort of quite contemporary?
I'm not sure it's really that contemporary, because we have cases, roughly as Sarah said, from approximately the 1980s onwards, and I think it's something we find kind of throughout that time period. But maybe Sarah, correct me if I'm wrong here. Whether this really stands out, I mean, one thing I mentioned, it seems to describe the data set as a whole. So we see these this prevalence of broken homes among people not involved in terrorist violence almost as much as those who do become involved in terrorist attacks. So I think it might describe the entire, let's say, radicalized population rather well. It so far doesn't really seem to make a difference in terms of increased risk for people who radicalize to then also continue on and cross a threshold to actual terrorist attacks.
Okay, thank you. Question for David. Can you speak about how social network analysis can be used to track online relationships and connections?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Yeah, it certainly can. So social network analysis has been used to look at those kinds of dynamics. So say Twitter and Twitter followers, or Facebook, or other types of social media. Basically, I think the best way to answer the question is this: basically, to do any kind of social network analysis, whether it's more sort of basic cross-sectional analysis or more advanced work, one needs a set of actors, and one needs information about the relations between those actors. So the relations between those actors can be resource exchange, they can be friendships, relationships, or they can be social media contacts. So following each other on Twitter or sending each other social media messages. I hope that helps. So the short answer is yes.
Great, thank you. And how did you distinguish between friends and associates in your data?
Yeah, so we tried to set some pretty clear criteria to determine friendship and associate ties. Now, friendships were determined by evidence within or statements within either the judge's sentencing comments or within the media articles that two people knew each other socially. So they for all intents and purposes, were named as being friends or named as being acquaintances. They knew each other. Associate ties were ties where two individuals were arrested together or seen together or participated in some event together. So just to be really clear, two people could be both friends and associates. They could be named as being friends or acquaintances and named as being associates, two friends who get arrested together stealing a car, for example.
That's great, thank you. I have another question for you, David. Some studies have argued that in radicalization trajectories, it is actually the strength of weak ties rather than that of strong ties that is a more important network variable in terms of mobilization to action. How do you see the strong ties, weak ties relationship playing out in your data?
That's a really great question. And it's a great question, partly because I don't know the answer, but I'd love to know the answer. So what we, in the data that we have, we were able to identify different types of ties, but what we weren't able to do, or didn't even try to do, was to look at, I guess, strength of ties between individuals. But certainly, I think it's fair to say that what we found was an effect for brokerage. So where an individual might broker between a really dense cluster of individuals out to a group of individuals who is not well connected to that big cluster. So in that sense, sort of forming a weak tie or bridge out to other individuals. So we did find that brokerage effect in the associate tie space, but certainly that question is a really good question, and one that we would seek to explore in some further work, but not one we can answer on the basis of the work that we've done.
Okay, no, that's great. Thank you. We've only got a couple of minutes left and still have some more questions. This session is really generating a huge amount of interest. Sarah and Bart, and then perhaps David, you might also want to contribute to this. We have a question. What can we decipher about those who become radicalized, who are well educated, in contrast to those who are from broken families or lower socioeconomic backgrounds?
Bart, do you want to take that one?
actually hoping to leave it to you, but no, I'll take a stab at it. What can we decipher for those who become radicalized? Well, I mean, if there's one thing I'd have to guess here, it does seem again that just very simply being in a program of education, having the means to pursue one, these seem to be kind of pro-social ties that on the whole, I would say, make it less likely for someone to actually take all the risks that are associated with becoming involved in actual terrorist violence. So we've got quite a few people in our data set who, have been pursuing higher education or were enrolled in it at the time that they became involved. And for the most part, I think those individuals took, let's say, roles in their respective extremist movements that were at least 1 or 2 steps removed from the actual use of violence. So again, I think it's a little bit too early to say anything for certain. We also have tons of exceptions for all of these kind of findings. But I would say it makes it on the whole a little less likely to become involved in actual terrorism.
Thank you very much, Bart. And David, my apologies, but we've reached the end of our time slot. So I'd really like to thank Bart, Sarah and David again for contributing such interesting and important work. And thank you everyone who submitted questions. Really hoping and looking forward to the publications that are going to arise from your research. The next session continues perspectives on radicalization pathways with 2 presentations on Southeast Asia. And this session will begin after a short break at 10:40 and will be chaired by Greg Barton. So thank you all very much.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.